Hey guys, in this video going to show you how I assemble and build my Serpent 989 shocks. Shocks are a really important part of the car, not only to absorb bumps in the road, but also they adjust the speed in which your car transfers its weight. So you can change your car from being nice and smooth to being really twitchy, all based on your shock absorber. It's really important to match your spring with your shock. All depends on how you drive and the conditions of your track, but I hope this helps with some tips. So the equipment you're going to need is some Loctite, Aramac shock oil, a set of vernier calipers, 5.5mm turnbuckle tool or hex wrench, set of shock pliers, a caster clip, and a little bit of wet and dry. Okay, so for the interest of time, today I'm going to show you how I put together one shock. We're going to be putting together a front 989 3-hole shock. What I like to do first is just get rid of all the flashing on the molded plastic parts. For this you can just use a knife or your bit of sandpaper. Just like to clean everything up. Later on in the process we're going to use these surfaces to measure, so you want to make sure that they're free of any burrs or mold marks. Big one to check is the pistons. Serpent's new 989 pistons, their new process of manufacturing are really consistent, and the pistons are nice and smooth and flat. If you're building this for another car or a different model, just make sure your pistons are really smooth and free from any burrs. Alright, so once we've done that, we're going to start off by just putting our O-ring in the adjust collar. During this process of building shocks, keep your silicone oil on hand because you'll need it a lot. So I just like to put a dab on the thread here. That way your adjusting collar can be adjusted nice and smooth and easily. I like to wind it just all the way up. Makes it easier later on. Alright, next thing we're going to put the piston on the shaft. So I've got our shaft here with the built-in washer, again new for the 989. Piston go either way, no problem. And this is where I just like to use a little dab of Loctite on the thread here. Again, using the paste makes it pretty easy. Put our nut on top there. Then our 5.5mm wrench, snip it up. And we're going to use our shock pliers. Try not to use anything with teeth or any sharp objects. You don't want to weaken your shock shaft. So we just nip that up. We don't want to go over tightening on that one. You don't want to mushroom the piston or crack it. Alright, so we've got our piston there, our plastic parts ready to go, and we'll now start to assemble the bottom part of the shock. So I like just to make sure that there's no swarf, you've checked all your metal bits, everything's nice and clean. We want to apply a bit of shock oil. I like to use the shock oil that I'm going to fill the shocks with. Other guys use like a lighter weight, but I don't think it really matters as long as there's some oil in there. Get our X-ring. We place that nice and square in there. Another bit of oil. You can't overly lube it, but you definitely don't want it to be dry. Now here we're going to put in our little guide, the plastic guide. What I like to do is just get your sandpaper, flat surface, or here I'm using the Protoform body sander, and I just take a little bit off this. This is probably one thing that you can do to improve your shock a little bit. So make sure you sand it nice and flat, but by sanding this and just taking a little bit off it, just puts a little bit less pressure on the O-ring inside there. Make sure you clean it out. So when we put our screw on, it limits the amount of pressure put on the O-ring, so it allows the shock shaft to move more free. So once we put that in, we're going to screw our top on, and we're just going to leave it loose for a second. I'm going to put our shock shaft. Try not to put it in at an angle, put it nice and square so you don't damage that O-ring. We're just going to feel how smooth that is there. When we tighten this up, we want to make sure that that smoothness doesn't change or it doesn't get tight. If it stays the same, it means that guide has not put any pressure on the O-ring, which is what we want. If you feel that tighten up, just take the guide back out and give it a little bit more of a sand. I'm just going to set that aside for the moment, and we're going to grab our ball end. This is the front, obviously, and we're just going to grab a little handy tap. This one's from Aramax. You can get it from their website. And we're just going to tap the first little bit of the thread on this, just to get it started on the shaft, because it's nothing worse when it's hard to get a plastic piece started on a steel shaft. So we're just going to pre-thread that to make it a lot easier. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to put some oil at the bottom of the body here for when we install our piston and shaft. I just like to watch it go all the way down to the bottom, and so it covers that whole bottom section with oil, and there's no area there that's not oiled up. This is going to get a little bit messy, so I'd suggest to get a rag. Then we're going to put our piston and shaft straight down. And the reason we put the oil in there is to save a lot of time later in bleeding. So now there's oil underneath the piston, which means we don't have to wait for it to go through the holes and to have the air escape. So we've sort of bled that, but not completely. So from here, what I'm going to do is just put my bottom on. Because we pre-threaded it, we don't need our shock pliers to hold the shaft yet. Again, make sure you use pliers that are designed to hold the shaft without marking it. So in the Serpent manual, your measurement for this is 14.5 mil. We're going to get back to that later. So we're going to, for the moment, install this one at 14 mil. And we're going to do that so we can adjust our rebound, which will be explained a little bit later. This is pretty crucial to make sure that it's 14 mil exactly. So we've got 1403. Just winded in a little bit. But what's more important is that the number is the same between both shocks that you're doing. So both front shocks should be equal and both rear shocks should be equal. 1402, 1403. As long as side to side they're perfect, then you're good. Alright, so we've got 1398. I think that's good for the demonstration at the moment. Alright, so we've got our oil at the bottom of the shock. We've got our 14 mil gap. Again, we're going to adjust that to make it 14.5 later, but it's just for the moment. Then what we're going to do is fill the shock up. So we've got our shock stand over here. Piston is still at the bottom. I'm using 800 weight for the shocks. A little bit softer than the kit. Alright, so from here, your normal bleed process. So we're just going to sit there and manipulate the shock until we see all those little bubbles disappear. You can use a shock pump to get rid of them. There's some cool ones these days that are automatic. But we'll break back to this once the air has bled out. I personally like to, if you're building a new car, I like to let them sit at least overnight without using a shock pump. So we'll be back. Okay, so we've allowed our shock to bleed and be free of all air. You want to make sure that there's no little bubbles or little clouds. Give it a good up and down to make sure that you don't see that. It's really important to make sure that there's no air in the shock. It'll make it not work as a shock when there is air in there and be inconsistent. Alright, so this is where the caster clip comes into it. I use the caster clip to set the rebound in the shock. The rebound is another adjustment along with the pistons and oil weight. Basically, you put your caster clip on the end of the shaft there. That's going to limit how far our shaft moves up. The bigger the caster clip, so the thicker, the more rebound you're going to have in the shock. Rebound is subjective. Some people like it, some people don't. I find if you have too much rebound, it gives you less grip overall, but a little bit is good to make the weight transfer a little bit faster to make a twitchier car. So we've pushed our piston and shaft all the way in I'm using a 2mm caster clip. Then we're going to grab our membrane and we're going to slowly slide it from one side of the body to the other. It's going to get messy, so have a rag on hand, and we're just going to go from one end to the other and then flatten our membrane on the top of the shock there. So the oil's going to flow out. That oil we don't want in there. But now when the membrane is on the top of the shock, we don't want to move it or allow it to open to allow any air in there. So now it's a sealed unit. So then we're going to carefully put our cap on top, making sure that we don't lift that membrane, all while holding the top or the bottom of the shock pushed up against the top of that caster clip. And just slowly thread it on. You'll still see some oil run out, and we don't want to upset that membrane. It'll start to tighten up on the rubber. Once you feel that tighten, you can finger tighten it up. I always like to give it a bit of a wipe with the rag here. And you're going to notice there will be some rebound once you let it all go. So it starts to come apart. We're going to remove our caster clip. Give it a bit more of a clean. And then you want to feel the shock. So it should feel silky smooth. There should be no bumps or notches in it. If there is, that is air, and that's something you don't want. You'll have to start again. So I like a little bit of rebound, usually a little bit less than half of the entire shock travel. So I think we've got about 6 or 7 mil there from 14 mil travel. From here, you want to build the rest of your shocks and ensure that you do the same method with the same caster clip, whether it's thicker or smaller. And then we can compare your 2 shocks. So I'm going to go ahead and build the rest of them, and we'll be back. Okay, so we put all the shocks together. I've inserted the balls in the ends as well. So what you want to do now is reset your shock length to the spec required. So with the Serpent front is 14.5. With the rear, I think it's 13 offhand. I'll put a little graphic up there. It's important for shock length to be equal also from side to side. And not only that, when you do install your shocks, just make sure that you do have the right length. If you're with a different brand car or a different shock, that you have maximum travel with droop and also ride height. One little thing that we can do to make sure our shocks are equal from side to side is fully extend the shafts and push them together. You should see them come in pretty much exactly the same. If they're not, it means that one's got more oil in it than the other. So you'll need to redo one of them. These ones are looking pretty good. So you can do a fast test, a slow test, but they should always come in the same. Another good thing to look for is they've got the same rebound. And these ones look pretty good. I am happy with them. Alright, that's how we do our shocks. Thanks guys.